Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Climate FinTech series by Finstep Asia. My name is Musheer Ahmed. I'm the founder and MD of Finstep Asia. Today with us is Simon Schillebeeck, who is a co-founder and chief strategy officer of Handprint, and he's also a professor who looks at the world of fintech and climate tech. We want to talk to Simon and understand more about the work that Handprint is doing in this space, but also see how fintech can make a real change on climate change, right? So Simon, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Musheer, for having me. Very happy to be here.
Wait, look, Simon, we've been talking for a while, and Handprint has been in the space for some time, trying to make a real change and impact on climate fintech, But before we do that, right, maybe I want to start off by introducing to the audience about your passion for the space and how it came about, the story behind founding or co-founding Handprint.
Sure. I can go back very far, but I'll be reasonably quick about it. So I studied commercial engineering back in the early 2000s and very quickly got annoyed with the main assumptions present in kind of neoclassical economics about how people behave and how people are. And so that led me to write my dissertation on Buddhism and economics. And so what would the world be like if the alleviation of all suffering for both animals and for other species was the main goal of an economic model? And so from that, I moved into business ethics as a specialization, kind of CSR, sustainability stuff. And then after a little journey around South America, I started working in a sustainability consultancy boutique in Belgium and the Netherlands, really focusing on the combination of innovation and sustainability. And then after a couple of years there, I did my PhD in innovation management, focusing on how organizations manage natural resources and on how this kind of sustainability incentives or sustainability paradigm this was 2009, kind of taking shape in Europe, how that also affects the innovation of organizations. And then fast forward a couple of years, I moved to Singapore to become an academic. So I'm still an academic at Singapore Management University, but I got reasonably quickly, a bit frustrated with the lack of real world impact. And so as part of a grant that I got to study innovation in the natural world, I co-founded a nonprofit called Global Mangrove Trust together with my, at the time, postdoc, who now is also my co-founder, of course. And out of that NGO, which still exists now, grew Handprint in 2019. And so Handprint was set up when the two founders of the NGO, Ryan and myself, started working with Matthias, our current CEO, on a pro bono project to integrate blockchain technology into the carbon credit market. So that was really where we were starting to kind of think about, and out of many conversations and like about 6 weeks of working on this pro bono project, we realized we really like working together. And also we wanted to do something that could have much more scalability than a non-profit where it's very hard, of course, to raise capital. So we founded Handprint and kind of started working hard on it just before the circuit breaker back in 2020 in Singapore. So really at the beginning of the pandemic. And so our initial focus with Handprint was on, can we create a very simple tool for e-commerce organizations to communicate to their customers at the moment of checkout, so the kind of critical junction in the user journey, that, hey, you're not just buying a product, you're also buying something awesome for the world. Because for every purchase that you make on our platform, we're going to do something good. And so how can we create a tool that is convincing, that is credible, and that is highly efficient? And so that was the beginning of Handprint back in early 2020. Now, of course, we're at the end of 2021, so a lot has happened, and very happy to tell you more about that.
I think it's been great timing in some senses because of the increased focus after COP26 and around COP26 on sustainability, and many other companies now integrating sustainability elements as part of their businesses, right? Now, I'm very intrigued to ask you why you guys looked at e-commerce as your first port of call, as it were, right? And what was the main reason that was the focus for you to begin with?
The main reason was we wanted to build a technology that was scalable. And so e-commerce is about, depending on who you ask, a $4.2 or $9 trillion business per year globally. So it has a lot of reach. During the COVID pandemic, of course, retail commerce was also dead. And so e-commerce was the main way in which companies interacted with customers. And we believed and still believe that a key reason why organizations are interested in engaging with Handprint or engaging with kind of sustainability, and we kind of typically talk more about regeneration, is because it appeals to customers, right? So a lot of recent research has been done in this space, and the findings are actually very homogeneous across countries. So we look at this in China, you see this in the US, you see it in Europe. What you find is that consumers are increasingly demanding that companies don't just do less bad for the world, but actively involve themselves in doing something good for the world. And so because consumers are demanding this and kind of increasingly voting with their wallets, companies that are in a B2C space that have a direct touch point with the customer need to do something for this. And so for us, it was a really logical step to go there. But we very quickly and interestingly learned as we went about our kind of emerging business, just the three founders kind of hacking away, that we got a lot of questions from companies that were completely outside of our original purview. And so our scope kind of quickly broadened to different use cases, which we are now developing with a variety of partners. And that helped us see that actually the technology we developed is much more scalable than just a plugin for e-commerce, and can actually be used in many different types of business transactions.
Right. And I think that's a very important point you make on how the consumer attitude globally has changed, right? And there are those statistics where 50, 60, 70% of all consumers are looking at changes. I was looking at, the Tetra Pak guys, right? So who are the world's leader when it comes to packaging, especially for drinks. And they had done a survey and they could see a similar response from the end customers, right? Like a massive amount of them were very conscious about having packaging which was sustainable or at least recyclable, right? And that's increasing. So maybe we get into the little bit of the weeds, right? If I may use that term, is how does Handprint's technology work? Right? What makes you not necessarily special and unique? If it is special and unique, I would love to hear that. But also, like, what's the what's the functionality of the tech?
Right. So Handprint is two things at once. So on the one side, we are a multi-sided market where we connect and curate NGO partners that are active in the regeneration of our planet. And so that basically comes down to, for us, like all types of projects that are actively doing something good for the world. Reforestation, coral reef reconstruction, ocean plastic cleanup, but also now more like social projects, like female empowerment projects, education projects that are organized by NGOs in kind of developing world context. So that's our supply, right? And so we work with these partners, we bring them on board, we digitize them, and we actually function as a commercial agent for all of these organizations. And our key goal as an organization is to ship money to these organizations and then monitor their performance and then report that back to the financiers. So on the other side of the multi-sided market, we have the companies and potentially in the future also end consumers directly that want to do something good for the world. And so that can basically connect on our market and say, okay, I'm just going to buy 100 trees, or I'm going to pay for the removal of a ton of plastic from the ocean. But we realized very quickly that simply creating a market isn't solving a problem. It's solving one problem, but it's not creating sufficient value to convince most companies to engage with that kind of process. There are a lot of impact markets. Even in the blockchain space, you have impact tokens, you have impact market. And so the simple marketplace in itself, we consider to be insufficient in terms of a value creation process. And so what we developed was a way for companies to use that market so that they can turn their business transactions, and transactions here is very broadly defined, into positive impact actions. So in very practical terms, what it comes down to is that we have created a technology that can listen to a transaction that takes place, typically in the digital space, and that for every transaction that takes place, we'll send a message, and that message actually incorporates a pledge of the company to send a small donation, a micro donation, to a specific project. So as I said before, so initially we did this for e-commerce, where it's very simple. You have a transaction, a financial transaction, and the company says 1% of the revenue of this sale is going to be rerouted to, let's say, a reforestation project. But then for instance, we did a big event with Lazada here in Singapore, and they wanted to use our technology not specifically for the e-commerce, although we're still talking with them about this, and hopefully that's going to happen at some point, because of course that would be great, but for an event. And so what we created for them was 1 tree per RSVP. Again, it's a very different type of transaction, but it's an online transaction that we can read, that happens, that sends a message that says, okay, great, you've registered for this event, we're going to plant a tree. And so you create a customer experience, a user experience at the moment of that the transaction is finalized, so the person confirms they're going to attend the event. And then afterwards, we do a reconciliation with Lazada that is then financing those trees. So those are 2 examples. We have many other use cases. We are working in digital advertising. We're working with credit card companies. We're working in the remittance space, in the microcredit space. So a large variety of use cases that all have the same idea in mind, that like if we have a big transaction volume that is actually completely unrelated to sustainability or to regeneration, but if a company or a company's clients are interested in using those transactions to do something good, then we can help them do that. And so as the last point, what I think is so interesting about this is that it changes the narrative around how companies typically think about sustainability. And so that the typical way of thinking about sustainability is we got to measure how much bad we do in the world. And that's our footprint. And then we got to offset that. And so we have some kind of budget that we set aside to do this, and that's kind of what happens. And so it's all about this kind of reduction of negative externalities, which is extremely important, but it's not very strategic. So what we set out to do is we talk to a company and say, like, what are your most important KPIs? Like, what is the one thing that determines your strategic growth in the next 5 years? Is that measurable in a digital way? Can we look at that as a digital transaction? And so let's say for a company in the remittance space, it's very clear, it's volume. For an exchange, it's transaction volume. For a company that does, cold lead generation, it's adding a new lead into a CRM system. All of those are digital transactions. And so we can activate all of those transactions, those KPIs for organizations, and say, okay, as long as I meet my KPIs, I'm going to do something good for the world. And so that's really the kind of narrative that Handprint is proposing, and that suggests that your growth can really be good for the planet.
I think that's a very fascinating concept, right? Like, in a sense, you are looking to integrate, but you're looking at different elements, right? And I also know you have a very, very interesting calculator for carbon footprint, right? So you call it regenerative responsibility calculator, right? I'm very curious to know why that particular, because most people try to just call it as your carbon footprint calculator, but it's a very nicely coined term. But I also want to understand how you guys are working through the metrics of that.
Right. So at the moment, the name is not finalized. I think it's called the Paris Agreement Regenerative Target. So the PART calculator. So the philosophy behind PART is that, again, it comes from this perspective that the way we have thought about environmental responsibility of an organization or of an individual is by looking at their carbon footprint. So how much bad are you doing? And that kind of defines your environmental responsibility. And that is intuitively appealing. But there are fundamental problems with this approach. The biggest problem in fintech, that's especially is very relevant, but also in a lot of other businesses, is that if you don't work in a company that makes things, minds things, or moves things, which means you don't work in manufacturing, you don't work in production, you don't work in kind of transportation, then that reduction of a negative externality, reduction of your negative impact, your footprint, is extremely hard for you to do as a company. What that means is that 75 to 80% of people working in the US, in Europe, in Hong Kong, in Singapore, that don't work for those kind of organizations, that work in services, that work in banking, that work in insurance, that work in fintech, that work in PR, marketing, I mean, name it, like the vast majority of us that work in an industry that isn't directly making, moving, or mining something, isn't able to do anything meaningful in the sustainability space. Because the best we can do as a service organization or as a digital company or as a fintech is, okay, we're going to buy green electricity. And that's kind of how we reduce our, and so that's not very interesting. And so if you're a hedge fund and you're having 10 people that are all working right now, working from home, so your environmental footprint is extremely small, right? You basically consume a little bit of electricity, that's very little. But in reality, the footprint that your company enables your employees to have is massive. Because if you work for a hedge fund, typically you make a lot of money. And so that consumption pattern that comes out of your employment status is what really drives all of the kind of climate change and biodiversity loss that we're seeing now. So what we set out to do with PART was to say, let's turn it around and let's look at the environmental responsibility of an organization, not as its footprint, but as the consumption it enables its employees to have. And then assign the organization with responsibility for that. So that is the kind of philosophy of how PART works. Of course, there is like a whole scientific calculation between this, but what it basically does is it assigns much higher responsibility to organizations that create high-paying jobs, but actually don't have a lot of negative environmental impact. So what we are saying is like, you guys should do more.
Right, and how can fintech companies, you spoke about e-commerce, you spoke about remittance, but there's a whole host of others, but how can the fintech companies actually make a climate change beyond, offsetting the carbon footprint? What are the other things that you feel that could be touched upon by fintech companies? Like where can they bring in incremental change, or if not incremental, at least significant changes for other companies or organizations to make a change as a broader industry theme, right? I know what Handprint is doing, and that's precisely what we need, but what other things do you see as interesting in the space currently?
I mean, I think for fintech, obviously, in the kind of broader sustainability agenda, financial inclusion is a big theme. So I think this is something that a lot of companies are looking at that's highly relevant. More focused on climate, there is a lot of work in the kind of verification of impact. I think there's a lot of fintech companies that are kind of broadly aligned with those objectives, measurement of ESG, green bonds, all of those kind of things. I think there's a lot of interesting kind of companies in Singapore, in Hong Kong, that are working in this space. My main interest is always in terms of like, yes, you're creating a business. Yes, even if your business is focused on, let's say, ESG metrics, that's awesome. But does that mean you're doing something good in the world? And so I think every business increasingly has the responsibility, either a moral responsibility, or it's going to be an investor driven or consumer driven demand or responsibility to say like, okay, we have a strategy for how we are going to connect our long-term growth to doing something good in the world, right? And what that exactly means, I think, for a fintech company has to be kind of linked to what their business case is. Like if you're building a fintech and you're, I don't know, like you're any kind of blockchain company, then of course you have to think about, okay, what proof of work, proof of stake, how do we validate, like what is the energy footprint of this? Is there something we can do in terms of reducing that impact? If you're building kind of permission blockchain systems, that may be less important, but then what your role is very often in that space is you are an intermediary or a decentralized intermediary that enables others to connect and use your platform. And so adding a layer of, like an optional layer, like of regeneration on that platform is not only a potential competitive advantage, but also kind of stipulates that you as an organization stand for something. And I think this is really where the world is moving to, and where the fintech space is either slowly or potentially begrudgingly going to move to as well, simply because the need at the moment is so high. The realization increasingly in Asia as well about climate change, the adverse effects that are real, that are happening now, is there. And so to maintain a license to operate, a social license, but also potentially an actual legal license to operate, this is going to be a very big thing. And I think some of the, let's say, the big crypto exchanges and so that we've been talking to, they realize this as well. And they say, like, we want to kind of jump the gun and say, how can we become a better corporate citizen that kind of contributes to society in a meaningful way, that does something that aligns with the policy objectives of the countries in which we operate. And yeah, regeneration, kind of social education projects, all of those different ones could have a significant role to play in that regard.
Well, look, that was a very interesting thought in terms of especially, how blockchain companies and exchanges, etc., are looking to offset their footprint. Now, moving ahead, what are if you had to pick 3 trends for fintech's influence in climate change, in 2022, what would be the top 3 most urgent or pressing needs that fintech can address?
The 3 most urgent ones. So on the ones, let's think, okay, one, I would say impact credibility, right? How do we solve the problem of double spending, which blockchain solves, for the double selling problem in impact, right? So in the impact space in general, the key question is, like, if you buy a kilo of plastic that some NGO in another part of the world is removing from the ocean, how do you know that NGO is not double or triple or quadruple selling that, right? You're entirely relying on trust. And so developing systems that enable us to create more verification instead of trust is, I think, an incredibly important thing to do. It's something that we are working on. Like Hedera Hashgraph is building something like this. There's other fintechs and blockchain companies that are working in this space. And I think that kind of coincides almost with in the mainstream banking space, where we look at green bonds and like all of that, the data reporting that has been done and putting those data on the blockchain. I think that is one thing that's really important. The second thing I would say is real-time feedback. In the impact space, for the longest time, and actually still by and large, if we look at how companies and NGOs as well report on what they are doing in terms of creating either positive or negative impacts, right? The reporting is highly discontinuous. So what we typically get is maybe a quarterly update, maybe something in the annual report. And increasingly, I think that investors and maybe also kind of activist consumers just won't be satisfied with this. So that creates an opportunity to create tools for visualization, for like credible reporting that just engage the audience in a very different way. And that could be around, like, okay, the number of trees you plant as a counter, but it could also be around much more accurate and real-time reporting about leaks in a pipeline for natural gas, or all of those things that have very adverse effects on the environment, but are happening constantly, and that can be kind of enabled by let's say a fintech-related ecosystem where you have satellite remote monitoring, where you have IoT devices, where you have this kind of convergence ecosystem of technologies that solves for these problems. And then, of course, there's financing, right? So if we look fintech more broadly also, and like what banks are doing in terms of kind of adjusting their portfolio of loan companies, kind of updating the criteria under which you can have a preferential interest rate. And so a lot of that work is going on in Asia, in the US, in Europe. And I think fintech companies can play a role in facilitating this, right? So how can we help organizations make better decisions about what to do and what not to do in, like, it can be in financing, because I think that's really where the biggest impacts can be had. But the same thing in terms of like insurance. How do you insure against types of climate risk? There's some interesting companies that we've been talking to that are building these tools to create peer-to-peer insurance contracts that are much more granular than a typical insurance contract can be if you're a small farmer in Brazil with a very small, I don't know, like a couple of hectares of land, and you want to create some kind of hedge against excessive rainfall or a shortage of rainfall. Like, you don't have a capability to do that in the existing market, because the way the insurance system works is just not tailored to these kind of small needs, but these needs are very real. And if you don't have that hedge capability, then as a small-scale farmer that is completely exposed to the elements, you lose your livelihood, and typically you don't have the financial ability to bounce back from that if this happens once in your life. And with climate change, the likelihood that it's going to happen once in your life, or maybe even every 2 or 5 years, is very high. So building those tools, that kind of parametric insurance or non-parametric insurance, but at a peer-to-peer level, where individuals are willing to take a very small part of that risk in exchange for some kind of premium, is very interesting. I think there is a lot of innovation in that space as well. Yeah, those are 3 ideas.
Perfect. Look, it's been a great pleasure talking to you about this. It's been a lot of learning in terms of what's happening. I do believe looking at each of our handprint, not just the footprint, is going to be essential going forward. And fintech can play a massive role in changing climate tech, not just because payments and everything else is going to be inherently everywhere, right? And that's going to be a big role. And if you can inculcate and support the sustainability practices that individuals and companies want to follow, it's about enablement in the end. So Simon, again, pleasure speaking to you. Yeah, go on, please. Yeah, you have final words.
I just may, because you just gave me that idea, something that I forgot to mention. I think it's so important. Like, if we're talking fintech now, it's almost impossible not to talk about NFTs, right? And what that represents, that kind of shift towards digital assets. And what's interesting is that, so we see this now in a variety of contexts, right? That recently Adidas announced they were going to do NFTs with like partners. They're doing it also to kind of do market testing. But so I think there is an incredible opportunity to use NFTs also for the creation of positive good. So one of the companies that I've been in touch with in Barcelona, they're called Nozima, and they've just done they're doing this. They've done a token sale, and they basically created an NFT platform for recycled plastic. And I think for what we are going to do in the future as Handprint, we're also going to look at this like, okay, people increasingly care about digital authenticity, right? So they want to have something that's digitally theirs, that they can prove digitally. That's what the NFT market is about. And so if we can connect that to doing something good, so for instance, like we're working with an artist and they're going to sell NFTs and they're going to embed reforestation in those NFTs. It's a very simple idea, but it's incredibly powerful if we can then link it to, if you resell that at a market price premium, then a percentage of that sale is also going to go back to that impact partner, in the same way that you can do this for artists, right? That are musicians that are saying, okay, everyone in the band is going to be rewarded if the record is played again. So with smart contracts, we have this capability of doing so. With NFTs, we have that as well. And I really see that in the future, people will have an account, like it could be MetaMask, it could be something else. Hopefully it could be Handprint, where they'll store not only their kind of I don't know, digital sneakers and digital sharks and so, but they'll also have like, okay, and here's my digital proof that I have 100 trees and 70 kilos of plastic, and that I went volunteering there, and so that this becomes much more of a social currency. They say like, I've done a lot of good in the world, and that's going to influence your job prospects in the same way that students now have like, they get experience, and so that influences their job prospects. They're gonna be questions from companies that care more and more about this, saying like, okay, what have you done for the world? What's your handprint? And can you show this? And I think the fintech space is going to be the space that enables this in a credible way.
Great, looking forward to it, and we hope this can be, a lot more fintech for good, NFT for good, and blockchain for good, right? A lot of people look at the other side of what blockchain has been doing from a crypto perspective, but there's a lot on the technology side that can be very beneficial. So again, thanks again, and I hope we get another opportunity to speak soon. And this is just the beginning, and we'll definitely have a conversation later in the year on the progress of Handprint. So on behalf of everybody else here, thank you so much, and to the audience, stay tuned. We'll have more exciting speakers joining us soon. Follow the Finstep Asia's page as well as our blog page on our website to know more about how fintech can make an impact on climate change. So thank you once again, Simon, and we look forward to speaking soon. Thank you.
Bye, Musheer. Thanks.